Okay. Buenos dias, React Alicante. My name is ERIK Rasmussen. And first, I'd like to say thank you to our sponsors, without whom this could not take place. I'd also like to make a quick mention of a startup called CodeSponsor that is helping make open source software more sustainable by providing some ad revenue to people that maintain libraries. If you do open source software, I recommend that you check them out. Okay, but I'm here today to talk to you about forms. Now, forms, I can say with some confidence that with maybe the exception of cascading style sheets, forms are the hardest problem in front-end web development. But why are they so hard? Well, there's much more back and forth communication with the user. You're not just clicking on a hyperlink or clicking on a button. And the rate of state change is much faster. Every time you press a key, that is modifying the state of your application, and you have to re-render your inputs, or maybe you have a validation error that you need to show. And which brings me to validation. So somehow you have to tell the dumb monkey that's typing on the keys that they're not doing something right. You have to communicate that. And also, you've got asynchronous network communication. Back in the 1990s, you could submit a form and it would refresh the whole page, but we're past that now. So generally, you're going to submit your form with Ajax, and you're going to need to display a spinner or something to let the user know that the form is being submitted. So how do we overcome all of these obstacles? Well, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. The good news is that all of us here are using one of the most popular, modern, sophisticated, battle-tested UI frameworks available. Facebook is literally serving billions and billions of pages with React every day. So awesome, right? The bad news is that we are using a framework that highly encourages unidirectional data flow, which forces you, the developer, to manage all of the state of your form, down to every little change of every value with every key press. So not so awesome. But what is this unidirectional data flow thing? Well, unidirectional data flow in React means that the data only ever flows down from the parent to the child components. If you're doing React properly, a parent is never going to ask a child for its state. That's not the way it's done. The parent dictates the state to the child. And the only way that the child can mutate the state is with a callback that the parent has given it. So what does this look like with forms? Well, with a form, when your user types into the input, it dispatches an event that has to update the state somewhere, either in set state or in some canonical data store somewhere. And that has to cause the input to re-render with the new value. So here's a simple example of a text input. This is the simplest possible text input you could have using a controlled input component. Now, a controlled component in React means that you're always passing a non-null value to the value prop of your input. If you pass undefined or you don't pass a value, then React will let the HTML DOM component, the DOM element itself, manage the state of its value. But React strongly is against that, and it's much better if you pass an actual value. And that way, React will guarantee that the value that's displayed in the form input is the actual value that you have in JavaScript. So let's look at the parts of this. First, we initialize our state, and notice we're setting it to the empty string, not undefined, so our input is controlled. And then we create a change handler. And this accepts a React synthetic event and calls this.setState to update our value, and the value is found in event.target.value. And then we give our value from our state and our change handler to the input component. So this is the bare minimum way that you can have a controlled component in React. But like most minimalist examples, it's not really very useful because you can't really build a form out of these, because then you've got your state is in each of your inputs, and when your form goes to submit, it has to request the state from its children, and we already described that as being not good in React. So that means that the state has to live up higher in the tree, okay? And in the same way that the text input was passing the value prop and the change component to its input element, now the form is going to have to pass the value and the change callback to each of its text inputs. And this is not a pattern specific to forms. This is how data flows in all of React. This is your state is up high in some component, and you have to pass it down with props. And you also have to pass, if you want to let your child modify the state, you have to pass it a callback. And if you've built very much with React, you'll know that these things get pretty messy pretty quickly. For example, what if you wanted to put a wrapper component around each of your text inputs? That wrapper component needs to know exactly what value props need to be passed all the way down to its input, and the callbacks and everything, and it has to manage all of this. And if your React application just gets above a very tiny size, this prop cascading, as it's called, can become a problem. But luckily, React has matured in the past few years, and we have a solution to this. Redux is an implementation of Facebook's Flux framework, which pulls the state even higher, almost out of the component tree entirely, into what's called a Redux store. And Redux also enforces the unidirectional data flow by requiring that any mutations to the state happen by dispatching what are called actions, and which filter through some reducer functions to mutate the state to get the next state. And the other benefit is that it allows any element anywhere in your state tree to read from your global state and potentially mutate your global state by dispatching an action. I won't go into any more detail about how Redux works, but it turns out that this is a useful way to manage state in forms, which is why I wrote a library called Redux Form. So what is Redux Form? Well, Redux Form consists of three main things. The first is a single reducer that you give to Redux that is going to manage the state of all of the forms in your application, whether you have one form or 1,000 forms. Just this one reducer, you plug it in and you forget about it, and then it just works. Next is a higher order component. This is a function that decorates your form component and injects in useful props and callbacks and form state. And last is the field component. This is a component that manages the state for each individual field in your application, in your form. And it gives you the value, and it gives you all your callbacks that you need to mutate state, et cetera. And also there's sort of a smattering of other little components and Redux selectors that help you manage things like arrays and things like that. So I think things have, wow, that was, okay. This is so funny when you see my next slide. Okay. Pardon the interruption. Good. Okay. So I was literally about to say, it seems like everything has gone pretty well so now it's time for some live coding. See, that's the way it works. So if we mirror, good. Hold on, let me try 720. 720. All right, that's pretty big. All righty. So, come on, Doc. All right. Now we can crank the size down. All right, we're good. So here we go. This is a pretty standard development environment here. We've got this is going to hot reload our changes as we make over here. So it hot reloads just fine. So this is just a nothing component here. So let's build a form with Redux Form. So the first thing we have to do is install the reducer. Now, any Redux application is going to have a file that looks something like this, where you're importing your reducers from various places, and you're combining them together to make a master reducer that you give to Redux. So here we're going to import from Redux Form, and we're going to mount it here under the key form. Now, this is fairly important. The Redux Form expects your reducer to be mounted here, and unless you have a really, really good reason to not do this, I suggest that you do. If you have to put it somewhere else, Redux Form can deal with that, but it's more complicated. All right, so now we have our reducer installed. And so let's build a form here. So we need to import our higher order component, which is called Redux Form, surprisingly enough. And we need to decorate this component with that. So the way you do that is like this. And here's where we can pass in configuration information to Redux Form. The only thing that is absolutely required is a form name. Okay? And when you do this decoration, the hot reloading breaks for some reason, but we can refresh. Okay. So let's build our form here. So let's turn this into a form, and let's do a div and a label. And so this is where we put our input, right? But we're going to use this field component. And field requires a name, so you got to have a name for your field, and a component. Now this is the component that your field state is going to be injected into. But for quick bootstrapping options, you can just say you can just use either input or text area or select one of the standard HTML inputs. So if we hit save here, we have a form input. So let's look over here at our Redux Dev Tools. Redux Dev Tools is something that makes using Redux very, very nice. So when our field mounted, it's dispatched a register field event to let Redux Form know that there's a field here and it's called first name. And so notice what happens when I give focus to this field. It dispatches a focus event, which has updated the form state to know that this is the field that's in focus. And as I type in here, I get one change action for every character that I typed. And if I blur, then it's blurred so that it knows in the state that this is no longer active. So let's look at what our Redux state looks like. This is our form where all of our form stuff is mounted. Demo is the name of our form. And here we have our values. and fields is keeping the metadata for each form. So we can even see this change as we type in here. It's changing there, down here in our field. Okay, so just one field is not very exciting, so let's make a couple more. Email. So I'll save this, and it hot reloads over here. And now notice that we lost our form data. That's because the hot reloading is unmounting the whole form and then remounting it again. And Redux Form, by default, when your form unmounts, blows away all your form data in Redux. This is generally what you want, but there are times when you don't want that. Like if you're doing a wizard form, for example, where you have a page with a bunch of fields, and then you hit next, and then another page with a bunch of fields, and you hit next, and then another page, and then you hit finish, and then you want to submit the whole thing. If you destroyed all your form data as soon as you unmounted the first page, you would not be happy. So there's a way to disable that by passing destroy on unmount false. So now that's not going to happen to us anymore. All right, so we have a bunch of fields here. We're typing in here. And remember, every key that I'm typing is dispatching an action, which is updating the state, which is re-rendering just that input. So when I'm typing in this input, it's not re-rendering the other inputs because it knows that the state of those inputs haven't changed. So we got to do something with our data, so let's make a submit button. We save, and now we have a submit button. Okay, so what's going to happen when I press the submit button? Well, it's going to do the default HTML browser thing and URL encode our input values up here. That was great back in the 90s, but we need something a little bit more modern here. So we're going to create an onSubmit handler here. Now, remember this decorator here is injecting a whole bunch of useful stuff into our form component here. And one of those is a prop called handleSubmit. And that is going to become very useful right here. And what that can do is that can wrap some other function that is going to be given the values of our form. And the handleSubmit is going to intelligently know if the function returns a promise, it's going to know that we're currently submitting. And it does a bunch of other things like cancel the submit if your form is not valid and things like that. So normally this would be something like Ajax put call or something. But for demo purposes, we're going to use this show results function that I have. And this is quite boring. All it does is it waits for half a second to simulate server latency and then alerts out our values. And because it returns a promise, Redux Form knows how to handle that we are submitting until the promise resolves. And so it injects things like we get a submitting flag that we can do something like disable our submit button. Submitting. So you can't press it twice, right? So now let's see what happens. We click submit, it waits for a second, and then it alerts our values. And the submit button is just disabled because the promise hasn't resolved until I click OK here, and now it's enabled again. So that's kind of useful. But we didn't get an email, and we need an email, so we need to add some validation to this form. So how do we do that? Well, there's a couple different ways, but my preferred way is to add a validate function here. And the validate function looks like it's given our values, all of our form values, and it returns an errors object. And the errors object has to be the exact same shape as our values object. So if our value had a field called email that wasn't valid, we need to put our error message in errors.email, okay? So let's write some validation here. If not values first name, then errors.first name, okay? And let's do the other fields. All right, so now all of our fields are required, okay? So now, for example, I can't hit submit. My field is not valid, and we're not even gonna try and talk to the server. But my poor user is very frustrated clicking on the submit button because we haven't told them that there are any errors in the form. So we have to figure out how to display those errors. Now, as you might recall, all of the metadata information about our field is being injected into this component here that we're giving it. And really, in the real world, you're never going to use just the string input here because you're always going to want to do something more with that meta information. So we're going to need to write a function here that we're going to pass it, okay? So this is a function that takes, among other things, input and meta. And it's going to return, what's it going to return? Well, I like to return the whole row where my input is. And you will see why that is useful in a minute. And so now this needs to be our input. Now, our input needs a name and a value and an on change and an on blur and an on focus and an on drag and an on everything. So that is often quite complicated if you're just using vanilla React, but Redux Form gives us all of those in this input object here, which we can destructure into the props of input. So we don't need this div around here anymore. So I think if I hit save now, nothing's changed. Didn't break it. Okay, but we want to be able to reuse this, so first name can't be this. We're going to have to pass in some sort of a label thing that we can use. So any additional prop that you pass here gets sent up to your component that you're rendering. So this is first name. And so again, it hasn't broken. So we can go and replace these other ones. With that, and yeah, good, we're rendering the input, so we can get rid of these. So our form is starting to look nice and concise here. And again, all we've managed to do so far is not break what we already had. So what we need to do is find where our errors are. So our errors and all our meta information, as you might have guessed, is in this meta object here. But what does that look like? Well, let's print it out and see what happens. Save, and wow, look at all this stuff we have here. So this is all of our meta information. We've got active, that's, most of these are Booleans, which makes it easy to modify your UI. Active is whether or not this field is currently active. Dirty and pristine are opposites of each other. They're sort of an industry standard for form state. And pristine, your input is pristine if it has the same value that you initialized it to, or if you didn't initialize it to anything, that it has to be empty. And this is useful for knowing if you even need to save to the server, because if they hit submit and if they hit save and it's not dirty, then you don't even have to do anything. And we've got valid and invalid are also opposites. And notice our field is invalid. And look, there's our error right there. And are we currently submitting? Has the submit failed? Maybe you only want to show an error if a submission has been attempted and failed. And then you've got these two other values here, visited and touched. These are sort of terms that I came up with to describe the state of your field. As visited is true if as soon as your field has obtained focus. So as soon as you go into the field, it's visited and it's visited forever. Touched is if you've gone into the field and then you've left the field, then it's marked as touched. And as you'll see in a minute, those are very useful for displaying errors. So, and these are obviously updated live, so if I tap in here, my active is now true. And if I type in here, I no longer have my error, and it's marked as valid, and it's marked as dirty. So, but now we know where to get our errors. So we can go down here, and we can say if meta.error, then we want to print out our error. All right, so great. Now we've got our errors, but it's a little offensive to when your user first gets to your form to say, these are required, you need to fix this. So that's where the other stuff comes in handy. So we could do something like if it's also visited, then show the error. So now we're not showing the error, but as soon as you get there, we're saying, hey, this is a required field. But I also think that's a little bit mean. And I normally use touched. So touched lets the user come in and gives the user the benefit of the doubt that they know what they're doing. But then if you tab out of the field, it says, whoa, 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 come back here. You got to fix this. Okay, great. So the other benefit of using touched is that when you click submit and your submit is blocked because you have validation errors, Redux Form will mark all of your fields as touched. So when I click submit, all the errors show up, which if the user doesn't know why the submission isn't going through, then that helps them. But if you've got 50 forms and you're just changing the UI to show one little error, it can be sort of hard to find. So because we're rendering the whole row in our render input here, we can do stuff like style the row if it has an error. So we can say class name meta.error and meta.touched, then error, else nothing. So that way, when you go through or when you click submit, it's very clear where the problem is. And you can do other stuff, like say you want to have it be a different color if it's active, for example. You can do, let's see if we can do this, meta.active. And then we can, like that. So now we're going to get, now as soon as you go into the field, it's marked as active, and it's easy to see where you are, especially if you're filling it out properly. So that's another thing that we can do. Okay, so let's say, here. So let's say we submit that, but that's not a valid email. So how do we add a different, an additional validation rule on here? Well, that's pretty easy. You can write your own regex, but I don't recommend it. So if we have an email, then if not is valid email, values.email, then we can say errors.email equals invalid email. So we save this, and without even going back over to the browser, it's already reloaded and displayed our error here. Now, this highlights an important point that is not totally clear to beginners with Redux Form. This validation is happening on every single render. Every key that you press, we're validating your whole record, and we're updating all the state. I get a lot of questions of, what do I call to trigger the validation? How do I call my validation? Redux Form is calling your validation on every single render, which is helpful because that means that your errors go away when they go away, and it gives positive feedback to your users. So that's also why we just saw the invalid email pop up when it did. And because, notice because we're doing the is it null or not check first you get the required, and then as you start typing, it goes back to the other error. Okay. So this is great for text inputs, but what if we want a different kind of input? So say we're doing some sort of sign-up form, and we're in Spain, so, oops. And you have to fill out what province you live in, okay? So that's great. Now we have a province input, but we don't want it to be a text input. We want it to be a drop-down, of course. So we need to make this. You guys still see that? We need to make this. We need to abstract out this piece here. Okay. So one way to do that. Well, hold on. I had an interesting observation the other day. So this is a render function, right? This is what we call it in React. It's a function that takes some stuff and renders out some React elements. But watch closely. Now it's a stateless component. Voila. So that's true. If you're passing in all your stuff in the object there, that makes it like props. But that literally just occurred to me a couple months ago. All right, so we want to abstract out this part of our component. So like we want to be able to pass in something that we can do like. One other thing here is we can do like we can reuse our label as a placeholder. That's always kind of nice. And so what we want to do is we want to have some sort of thing that we can render, and we can pass it what it needs to render this next line here. And so what we need to do is we need to create a function that creates these inputs. For example, we could do something like create renderer, and you pass it that render function, and it outputs one of these stateless components. So down here we can say const render input create renderer. Let's move that up. And here's our render function that takes our input and our label. And what does it output? Well, it outputs this guy here. So if nothing has gone wrong, everything's still working. We haven't broken it yet. That's good. So now we have this one line abstracted out, and we can do we can make a input render select. Yep. So we can just make it a select. Yep. Selects don't have placeholders really. So now we have a render select, and down here we can change our province to be a render select. And voila, we have our select here, but we don't have any options. We haven't done the options yet. So we need a bunch of options. So we need a list of provinces from somewhere. And there we have. So how do we get our options in there? Well, we could make this specific to rendering just a select for provinces, but we can also, remember how we passed in label and it just got passed into our renderer here? We can also just go over here and pass in our options just as if this field was a select itself. So this is one of the most common React patterns ever, is going through an array and outputting elements. So this is an option, and we gotta have a unique key. And value, and this is also province. And we close our option, and we reformat. So this is going to give us all our options, and it's going to be passed to our render select here, right? But we don't have any. They're not there yet because we're not doing anything with it. So how do we get that? Well, it's going to be passed into here, right? And you could like pull children out of here and then pass it in over here, but you could also do like just get all the rest of the props here and pass in all the rest of the props to here. Okay, so that way down here in our render select, we can pull out our children and put them here. And now, if we come over here, wow, got our data. We should probably, just so we can yell at them when it's not there, we can give an empty one too. Okay, and we can even, so how do we make this required? Well, we come up here, and we take some of these, and now, all of our styling and our error management is being done right in here for all different types of components. And so if we click submit, it's there, and then we can fill it out. Oops, spell my name correctly. And I live in Cantabria, so we can submit, and then we've submitted our data to the server. There's many other, so many other use cases for this. There's other stuff that Redux Form does for you, like managing submit errors that come back from the server that you need to display, and asynchronous validation. When you blur off of a field, it can go and call something like if you're signing up and it needs to tell you if your username is taken or not. There's a bunch of different stuff, but I don't think we have that much time. But this is a general look. This is a general look at how you build forms with Redux Form. You're generally going to have a whole bunch of fields here, and you can pass additional configuration props to your components that you need right here in the field. So you really only need one type of Redux Form enabled component renderer for. You can have something that get a date field or whatever, and you can pass in the configuration that those things need down here. Okay, so back to the presentation. Okay, we survived the fire. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about the stats of Redux Form. Redux Form has over 7,500 stars on GitHub, which, when I last looked, is more than the next 4 React Form libraries combined. And a couple months ago, we just passed 500,000 downloads every month. And the popularity of this library shows no signs of slowing down. React is growing, Redux is growing, and Redux Form is sort of riding that wave. It's in use by teams at thousands of corporations and agencies around the world, including Airbnb, and even the FBI is using it for some internal forms. Now, by no means do I boast these stats to put down the other form libraries. The other form libraries are great, and many of them do things in ways that I think are cleverer than what I've come up with. But there are other benefits of using a library that's very popular. The first is that I've seen so many hundreds of use cases come in feature requests and things where someone says, well, it works sort of like this, but my requirements say I need it to do this when this is not true, and then send it over here. And so many different people have come and have modified it, have submitted pull requests and made it better and made it more extensible and more it's very likely that whatever your use case is, Redux Form already does that. In fact, I use it, and the other day I had a problem where I was like, oh, it doesn't do this by default. I wonder if it'll do this. And I looked, and there was a config parameter for it. The other benefit of being so popular is that there's a vibrant online community of people. They're making video tutorials, writing blog posts, and willing to help on Stack Overflow. Every time I go to a Redux Form question on Stack Overflow, it's already answered because there's so many people, there's such a good, healthy community. So if you're using Redux to manage state in your React application and you need forms, and probably you do, I recommend that you try Redux Form and join our community. Thank you.
You have to tell us how do you split your screen, which fancy software is that, please?
Divi, D-I-V-V-Y.
Can you show it? Is it free?
I think it is.
Thank you.
There's a bunch.
Yeah, okay, so basically my question is a little bit specific to validation. So basically my project, I use a form reset, dispatch form reset, and then my validation stopped working. And then I tried to dispatch, change, and then untouch, but it becomes messy. But then I've used initialize. And then what's your recommendation to use initialize in component, or for example in another place Saga, or any other place?
It depends on the use case. Maybe we can get there later and you can show me more of exactly what's going on with your particular problem, but there's probably ways to solve it.
Do you have a suggestion layer, or there is a way to create one like a normal component?
A suggestion, what?
In the selector, you can write and say, for example, country.
Well, there are many React components that do that, and Redux Form doesn't care what component you use. The only thing Redux Form absolutely needs from your input component is it needs to give you a value, and you display that value, and it needs to give you an onChange that you call to modify that value. And the rest can be whatever input component there are. There's a bunch. I use React Select for that, and there's a new one called anyway, there's a bunch. Downshare.
You have to change initially from const to let your component to decorate it. So Redux is immutable, Redux is meant to be immutable. Does your library somehow mutate your initial component, or why?
No. That's because when you decorate a component, what I could have left it as const and then changed my export statements to export default, and then because that's what a higher order component does, is it's a function that takes a component and gives you a new component. And personally, I just like the syntax of reassigning the same value to that. But it doesn't have to be that way.
So Redux Form is just a higher order component then?
Yes.
Perfect.
Sorry, that wasn't clear.
The last question, someone? Okay.
Nice.
So, thanks, Eric.
También hablo castellano.